Welcome to the questions and answers part of session 5 of a lecture on international political economy. First questions. How does property come about and what gives us exclusive property rights over an object? If we look at the question historically, we can guess that probably for thousands of years, if not tens of thousands of years, there was something that vaguely resembled property, in the sense that probably even in the Stone Age there were certain things that certain people would have laid an exclusive claim to. We don't know how people in the Stone Ages actually lived, but most likely there was at least such a thing as collective not property, but collective command over certain objects that would not be shared with everyone. So one can say that kind of something like property probably exists. But it only really becomes property if this relation between human beings and objects is then sanctioned by law, which means that there is a legal code that codifies that there is this kind of relation between subjects and objects, in which objects are the property of someone, and these kinds of legal relations of course only can exist if there is a state, an authority that will sanction those laws once again, and that will enforce those laws if they are broken. And here we can also see a certain historic evolution towards the emergence of property in the narrow sense. However, property also became more and more important, and in the form as we know it, it's rather a product of the last couple of hundred years in being such a defining institution. And how does property concretely come about? There is this rather idealistic narrative that, for example, John Locke, the great political philosopher of property, proposed, where property comes from human beings creating things with their own hand, and this is what creates property, and this is a narrative that gives legitimacy to property because it's something you created on your own. So who would challenge your right to that thing that you created? If you look at it more critically, historically, then property and the emergence of property typically is a combination of violence and then the results of this violence being sanctioned by law. And one of the most famous examples for this is the privatization of the commons in England and in Britain, where there were lands that were communal lands, so everybody who was part of the community could use them to have, for example, their sheep herd there. And then at a certain point in time, certain typically parts of the nobility said, okay, no, this is my land now, and all of you are just trespassing on my land, so get off of that land. And these very same people who laid claim to this land also were part of the political elite, so they had the means to then make these results of violence become law and become property. So you can give different narratives, but in the end it's a question of legally sanctioning a certain relation that is there, and historically it's strongly interrelated with violence. Next question relates to this. This question: when private property has not always been there and it is a condition for trade, how can one say that the current free trade regime is rather the result of absence of political restrictions than a result of a capitalist world order? This question refers to the great paradox of economic liberalism, because economic liberalism on the one hand always claims well, the state should stay out of the economy and let businesses do what businesses do. On the other hand, the very practices of businesses always presuppose a very strong state that established the framework under which businesses can operate, which to a large extent is the establishment of property and sanctioning property, and this actually requires a rather strong state. And we see this demand for a strong state that will actually create property where it did not really exist before in these discussions on international property rights, intellectual property rights when it comes to international trade, because then the idea for a certain medication maybe, which did not really was recognized as property internationally before, is then transferred into a form of intellectual property with the consequences or positive consequences for those who have the property rights afterwards and negative consequences for those who don't have them. However, despite of this general paradox existing, it's not that the claim for the state to stay out of economy is just a lie or is just nonsense, because of course a state can do more or less in regulating or intervening in the activities of businesses when it comes to trade. So a state can either impose tariffs or it cannot impose tariffs, and this is not a distinction that does not make sense. However, one should always be very careful about this claim of an economy with no state or with little state intervention, because typically it requires a lot of state activity. Next question. How can the outcome of trade always be good for both sides if they don't have all information of the consequences of the Trade Act? This is an excellent question in the sense that Nobel Prizes were given out for these kinds of questions, of course not for 2 lines, but for the idea that information and knowing and being able to assess the consequences of certain economic actions is a prerequisite for markets operating in the way that positive theories or optimistic theories of market interaction claim that markets work. So if we have a disbalance of knowledge, so if one party really knows what the stuff is worth and what you can do with the stuff and the other party doesn't know it, then trade will of course probably be better for the person that knows more stuff. The simplest example is if you buy something, be it online, be it in a shop, and the person who sells the thing knows that this will break after half a day, and you don't know that it will break after half a day, and you buy it because you believe that it will last for 2 years, and after that you don't have any right to reclaim it because it's broken, then this is asymmetric, and then trade will not work this way. So the question of knowledge in market relations is a very important question. If free trade creates incentives to produce what is most effective for the respective country, does it not automatically make you dependent on your trade partners and thereby weaken your negotiating position? There are different perspectives to look at these kinds of dependencies, and those who have a more optimistic view, they would always speak of interdependencies rather than simply of dependency, and saying, well, yes, if you have this trade relationship and you specialize in one thing, the others specialize in another thing, then you depend on one another. So you depend on the others, but the others will also depend on you. So it does not necessarily weaken your position with them because they have the same problem, so to speak, but also the same leverage. So it's interdependence, and this you could go on to argue is actually something good, because then everybody has an interest in keeping on interacting with the others. So if you are in this relation of interdependence, you would, for example, not try to betray your business partner because you know that tomorrow and the day after tomorrow and next year you'll still have to do business with them. So if you betray them today and they will get to know it afterwards, it will not help you. So there is this very optimistic view of dependency as interdependency. However, you can also say that it's in fact not always this symmetric, and there might be dependencies where one is in a weaker position and depends on the others. So if someone is the exclusive producer of something, or if one nation needs the products of another nation more than vice versa, or if generally in the negotiations one is more powerful, then it might actually be dependency rather than interdependency. And then there's what we call dependency theory, which evolved in Latin America mostly, which gives this rather pessimistic outlook on international market relations, with the global southern countries depending on the countries from the global north, and therefore of course claim for more autonomy of the southern economies. May you please explain the message of the diagram on the right side on slide 13 once again? Of course I will. So first, what we see here is a diagram of the total volume of imports for developing and emerging countries, for developed countries, and for the world in total. And this diagram, it starts with 100 for each of these lines, which means that we have a diagram which is normalized or scaled with one randomly chosen point at the beginning. So this time it's the first quarter of 2010, so it's roughly directly after the big recession of 2009. And then we see how these develop in comparison to one another. However, you should not mistake this in the way that this says something about the absolute volume, because as we know from last week, the absolute volume of trade in the developed countries is much greater than in the developing and most of the emerging countries. However, what you see here is how the imports, which is here shorthand for the overall trade, for all these countries develop in comparison with one another. And when we look at the green line representing the developing and emerging countries, we can see that the total volume of imports of these countries increases by 30% over those 4 years that are in question here. So that's quite a bit of an expansion, while the total imports of the developed countries, they only grow by probably 12% or so. And here you can even say that from the beginning of 2011 to the beginning of 2013, it almost stagnated. So there wasn't much developing or much growth in the imports of the developed world. So you can see that their overall trade did not grow much, did not change much, while the overall volume of trade in the developing countries and emerging countries did grow substantially. So you can then see that there is a shift, and that trade becomes more important quicker in the developing and emerging markets, and from that you can conclude that overall there's a growing participation of these countries in trade. Next, how can trade be more sustainable, and what are the main challenges it poses for achieving the sustainable development goals by 2030, or is this not even part of the international political economy debate? We're going to discuss the question of the environment towards the end of the lecture. And of course, trade does play an important role here. However, there is little talk, at least little political talk, about limiting trade in order to save the climate or so. This is not the road many politicians would try to go down. However, of course, the increase in international trade does pose ecological problems. So maybe two ways in which it poses problems quickly. So on the one hand, of course, that transportation produces carbon dioxide emissions. So if you ship stuff from China to Germany rather than producing them in Germany, this will mean that ships will burn a lot of fuel. So, and this is not very clean fuel that they are burning. They're not burning it in a very clean way. So this does have its ecological effects, and probably most of you once or twice in their lives have made this experience that you buy something online, and even if you don't buy it on Chinese platform like Alibaba, but buy it on just regular Amazon from your country, it might happen that you didn't look exactly, or it wasn't described correctly, and then you have a shipping time of 3 weeks or so, and then it might be that it will be sent in from China to your country, and just like shipping some item or worth €3 from China to Europe is of course not sustainable. So we have this transportation problem, and then we also have the problem of ecological standards in production. So if we have more international trade, it's more likely that stuff will be produced somewhere else than where it is consumed. And as a general rule of the thumb, you can say that in most richer countries, ecologic standards in production are much higher than in emerging and developing countries. And more trade means that more stuff that will be consumed in the richer countries anyway will be produced somewhere else in the world, and will then probably be produced with lower ecological standards. So it's more likely that coal power will be used for producing the stuff if it's produced in China. It's more likely that general ecological standards are lower there in production, which means that the local environment will be badly affected by it, and you see this in most producing hubs in the world, that the air quality, the water quality there is very bad and much worse than in most richer countries. And you also, of course, see this not only locally, but also when it comes to emissions that affect the overall climate. So this is a problem. Why are richer countries reluctant to participate in free trade with developing countries when it would help them? I think it's helpful to distinguish two things here. One is free trade and the other is free trade. So free trade, I would say, without the quotation marks, we could say is this ideal concept in which we would actually have free trade. We wouldn't have agricultural subsidies in the richer countries. We wouldn't have any hidden barriers in the richer countries for imports from the developing countries. And then it would probably still not be the best way to develop economically. However, this would probably help some of the least developed countries to export more agricultural stuff. It would, however, probably hurt the agricultural sector in the richer countries, which cannot survive without the subsidies that they receive. So what the rich countries then do is they engage in what they call free trade, but de facto they are guarding those sectors in their economies that would not survive free trade. But however, push opening of the sectors that their economies are strong in the developing countries. So there is this free trade, which only has the label of free trade, but actually is a very asymmetric thing. And then we have the more idealistical, theoretical concept where there's actual free trade, but that's hardly ever there. So when we see the same thing in the history of the British Empire, which only opened the textile industry to free trade after it developed its own textile industry and thereby destroying the one in Bengal. So we always have to be very careful if we talk about free trade as the realization of an ideal, which hardly ever happens, or if we talk about free trade as those policies that actually take place that are typically asymmetrical. Next question. Developing countries try for years to catch up on the world market and the goal of trade liberalization. But it seems as they would never reach the goal, partly because some developed countries make use of their comparative advantage and still subsidize certain industries, e.g. the agricultural sector, to remain in the major role and keep developing countries down in order to increase or at least hold their benefits. Which measures could be taken, e.g. by the WTO, to increase fair play? This is exactly the problem that I just described. And here the problem is that the question at the end supposes or presupposes that the WTO actually is an independent actor with a lot of agency that can dictate the conditions of trade to the richer and the poorer countries. But in fact, the WTO is much rather a negotiation round or an arena for negotiations. So in fact, the WTO does not have that much agency to convince the richer countries, particularly since the richer countries also have more say in the WTO. So ideally we could say, well, the WTO should say that the richer countries should also open their agricultural markets to the least developed countries if they push for free trade in other sectors. However, the WTO doesn't really have this kind of agency to do that. Next question. On slide 14, you mentioned that especially in the agricultural sector, free trade would help developing countries. How could that be, since the developed countries with their high technological agriculture system can produce to lower prices as a small developing country? We can observe that in Africa, when the cheap chicken from Europe, which is left over in the production, floods the African market, because the local chicken farms aren't able to produce at such a low price. Here I want to make 2 points. So first, there are different sectors in agriculture that have different logics when it comes to production. So in the lecture I already distinguished between capital intensive production and labor intensive production. So we have capital intensive production where you need a lot of machinery to produce efficiently, and this also means that you need a lot of money to buy that machinery. In labor intensive production, you need a lot of labor power, and we have both in agriculture. So if we look at corn, for example, that's something where you don't need many workers to do the harvesting. You just need very, very big harvesting machines that can drive on over fields that stretch from one horizon to the other horizon. And we see that particularly in much of the United States. And this is something that most developing countries could not compete with, and particularly the least developed countries can probably not compete with that. However, you shouldn't try driving a harvesting machine over a strawberry field or field with paprika or tomatoes, because after that you will only have strawberry jam of a very, very low quality. So there you need a lot of farm workers who just bend over and do the picking. And that's something that when it's done in Europe, it's typically done by workers mostly from Africa, often without a legal migration status. We have this in Italy, we have this in Spain, and to a lesser degree with different migrant workers, we also have it in Germany or France. So this is something that is very labor intensive, and with some of these trades that could probably work in parts of Africa, for example. Of course, there you have the problem with transportation of fresh produce. However, you also have a lot of canned tomatoes that are used and needed. And for example, you also have the problem of processed tomatoes that are then sold in Africa and that will destroy the tomato farming there, that are grown in Italy with EU subsidies by illegal immigrants from the same African countries. And if there would be an open market, this would not be that easily the case, and possibly there would also be less people from Africa who would have to migrate to Italy in order to be underpaid tomato pickers there. Though we have to distinguish labor intensive from capital intensive production in agriculture. Secondly, what you described does exist, but it exists under conditions of not open markets and under conditions of subsidized agriculture in the richer countries. And remember, subsidies to not competitive industries is a non-tariff trade barrier. So that's something that's not supposed to happen under a free trade regime. So if the European Union and the United States were to abolish those subsidies, which is probably not going to happen anytime soon, then some of the least developed countries would have good chances to export products from labor-intensive agriculture production. However, I'm not saying that this is going to happen, and this is a very likely scenario to happen. However, it's an argument that free traders frequently make when they are confronted with the fact that some of the least developed countries do not develop very well after opening their markets, and this is how they will counter. However, I don't see this as something that's politically realistic, so I would say that this is then once again the distinction between the actually existing free trade regime and this ideal world of free trade. I don't understand very well what is intra-firm and inter-industry trade. Could you explain about this more? Yes. So if we look at this idea of comparative advantage, then the idea is that every country will specialize in the production where they can produce most effectively. So for example, you would expect that maybe Germany is best at brewing beer and France is best at producing wine. So we have the Germans who focus on beer, we have the French who focus on wine, and then the French can import the German beer and the German can import the French wine. And so each of these countries have their sector where they produce better, and so there is always trade only in one direction over the border typically. However, this is not what we see when we look at the trade that actually happens. So for example, if we look at car production, there is no good reason to say that in general Germany or France have a total comparative advantage when it comes to producing cars. And you also see a lot of German cars on French streets and a lot of French cars on German streets. So within the car industry, there is trade in both directions, and this is what we call intra-industry trade, which does not make that much sense from the perspective of comparative advantage theory. Intra-firm trade does mean when we see trade happening within one firm. So we have, for example, one car producer that for example, it could produce the engines in Italy, it produces the car doors in Hungary, and then both of them are assembled in Germany. And then it might be that the German branch of this firm buys the car doors from the Hungarian branch and the engines from the Italian branch. So we have kind of trade within this one firm, and it makes even more sense when you think that some firms not only produce one kind of product like cars, but like you have like those big miscellaneous firms like, I don't know, maybe Siemens or Samsung, which produce everything from a train to some small consumer devices, and there is trade that happens within this firm, and this is then even further removed from anything we would imagine when we discuss Ricardo's theorem. Next, talking about the section on subsidies on page 120, what are cash grants and what are tax holidays subsidies. So subsidies are methods by which government try to help certain industries within the countries. And what helps companies most is having more money or being able to produce for less money. So a cash grant basically means that the state will give a company money mostly in order for it to invest in a production plant. So if a car manufacturer says, I want to build a new manufacturing plant in this country, and I have to do this because I'm in competition with other car manufacturers, then the state might say, well, we'll give you a couple of millions to build this factory here. So they give just a cash grant. And this, of course, helps this car manufacturer, and it can help them to sell their cars for lower prices because they can produce them cheaper because they don't have to carry the full load of the investment. So this helps them. And a tax holiday, this sounds fancier than it is. It just means a certain different ways of having companies pay lower taxes. So just from the top of my head, 2 examples in Germany. For example, Germany raised the taxes for energy in the last couple of years, and the energy intensive industries such as steel production, who need a lot of energy, they are exempt from these taxes. So I, as a consumer, have to pay more taxes on electricity that I use than a steel producing firm will have to pay on the same amount of electricity. And it is debatable whether this constitutes a subsidy. Similarly, it's also, for example, in the hoteling industry, we saw that the value added tax, so the tax that for every room that is booked has to be paid, was lowered in Germany for hotels from 19% to 7% a couple of years ago. And this could also be said to constitute a subsidy, because now when it comes to consumer prices, German hotels can charge 10% less than before and still earn more money from it. And you can also say that this constitutes a subsidy. How can NTBs be recognized, and what is the consequence if a country has NTBs in place, even if they are part of the WTO? In general, there is this legal expression that when there is no plaintiff, there is no law. So it's always that someone has to complain about a practice being unfair before it will be punished by WTO. So let's say that Germany gives a German car producer a couple of hundreds of millions of dollars for opening a factory here. Then it might be that a French car manufacturer will just say, well, this is so unfair, they get so much money, and then they will run to their government daddies, and then the government daddies of the French car company will say, well, this is a subsidy by the German state for the German car industry, and then they could sue Germany in front of some WTO court. And for example, it could either then say, well, this is an illegal business practice and forbid Germany to pay these kind of subsidies, or on the other hand, it can also allow France to reciprocate on this by raising tariffs vis-a-vis German cars. So it would, for example, say, well, now you, France, are allowed to charge 20% of tariffs on 1 billion euros worth of cars from Germany to get to even this problem out. This example was only half good because the struggles between Germany and France would probably be settled in the European Union rather than in WTO, because they are a customs union, but you get the idea. So take what I say, but insert other countries there than Germany and France. My second question might not be mentioned in the text, but I still think it is related to it. The WTO and its rules encourage free trade and reject trade barriers such as tariffs, for instance. Market openness and free trade are key components of it. However, countries such as China protect their domestic market by acquiring product information from companies or not allowing firms to operate within their country. So they do not abide by the market openness principle, while other countries have opened their markets for China. Of course, it is not possible to just close the markets for China, as it is too big of an export nation, but does the WTO not have any power to scrutinize or force China to open their markets? Can China's system be described as state capitalism? So in general, I would say yes, a lot of countries complain about Chinese economic practices. In addition to some of those that you mentioned, it's also that the China is set to undervalue their own currency vis-a-vis the dollar, which makes Chinese products cheaper as compared to products from other countries, which will also give it an edge. And some of these problems and complaints are actually the rationale behind the trade war waged by the United States against China. And these are not just some crazy ideas of Donald Trump, as it is sometimes portrayed. It's the fact that other US governments before Donald Trump, even back to the Clinton administration, made similar complaints. And for the most time, China was kind of good to defend their own position and play them out. However, these are real questions, these are real issues, and it's always the question whether the other nations are willing to take this fight with China, because they also have a lot to lose, because they don't want their companies to lose market access to China. So China is not only an important exporter, it's also an important market for companies from other states. And then if the other states would take China to a WTO court for a certain practice that they do, they would still have to make the case. But these are real issues that are there. But again, it's not necessarily the case that the WTO as an institution would have the agency to step in and clap on China's fingers. It's rather that other countries would have to take this role and then take us to the WTO, where the negotiations or where the trial would take place. Do you think Germany's new mercantilistic model will come to an end due to the coronavirus? The administration of Donald Trump negotiated a Phase 1 deal with China. Does this Phase 1 deal lead to fundamental changes in US-China trade? Even though most people criticize Donald Trump, isn't his administration right that really big trade surplus of China costs the US wealth year by year? So, in general, I would say that Donald Trump and his administration is right in complaining about Germany and about China, because these are two of the countries where the largest trade surplus and current account surplus in the world. And this is an economic problem, and it has something to do with practice that you can be critical of. Does this cost the United States wealth? Is the question of how you define wealth. It means that a lot of stuff is delivered to the United States. So if you think of wealth as having a lot of stuff, then it actually gives the United States wealth. However, of course, it means that the other countries amass a lot of money and get a lot of money from the United States, which then somehow has to flow back in form of credit. We'll discuss a little bit more about this in 2.5 weeks after the Pentecost break, when we discuss the financial system. It's not entirely clear how the deals between the United States and China will actually affect the relations, so I'd rather comment on what the coronavirus might mean to the German model. You refer to it as neo-mercantilist, which I kind of like, because there is something of mercantilistic thinking in the German model, and even goes so far that Germany hoards a lot of gold and dollars. So it's really kind of this mercantilistic thinking that's going on right there. And if it really happens in the way that after the coronavirus crisis, many corporations will reconsider their global production chains, this might be a problem for Germany, because this might mean that production will be relocated to locations near the consumption, which could on the one hand mean that some of Germany's export industries will be relocated to other countries, so fewer cars will be shipped from Germany elsewhere. It could also mean that on the other hand, it does not necessarily mean that the stuff that Germany imports will then be produced in Germany, but more likely maybe in Hungary or in Poland. So it might be a problem for the German system, which heavily depends on exports. However, you can also wonder if all this export orientation really does German citizens that much of a favor. Does it really increase wealth in Germany? That's debatable or uncertain. So it's quite likely that this system will become or will get under pressure due to the coronavirus. But not only due to the coronavirus, it was already set to get under pressure anyways in the last couple of years, particularly when it comes to the automobile industry, because no one really knows what's going to be the future of automobility. Can the campaign America First and the actions of President Trump be defined as mercantilist fallacy? To some extent you can argue this way, because if you listen to Donald Trump discussing deals, it does not sound the way that free traders would discuss about trade deals, because when free traders discuss them, the best trade deal is openness, and that's as good for one side as it is for the other side. If we listen to Donald Trump, then a deal is either good for one side or for the other side. So he kind of talks about deals as if it is a zero-sum game. So there is something of this approach to trade as a zero-sum game rather than a positive-sum game in the thinking. However, as I just explained, I wouldn't just reduce his talk and his thinking to that, because the American production sector actually does have a problem, because countries such as Germany and China build these big trade surpluses, and there are good economic reasons to challenge this international model as something that is not sustainable. Next question. My first question is about the effects of free trade on people. You argue that free trade can have a negative impact for people's lives in the short run, whereas it might result in something positive in the long run. I wonder which approach is really the best, because politics and elections are often about short-term promises and short-term measures. However, one might argue that measures which aim at the long term might be more beneficial to society as a whole. And this is always how free trade advocates would argue. They would always argue, well, maybe we lose some jobs now, maybe we lose some profits for certain companies in this country now, but overall, on balance, we will win. And if we look into the future, 10, 20, 30 years, we'll even have more and better paying jobs in our country because of free trade. And this is their argument. I would say there are two problems with this. First, it is doubtful whether this will actually really always happen in this way, that it will be better in the long run for everyone, because you might have those general shifts of power from labor to capital that I mentioned, which might mean that free trade overall will not actually help everyone in the long run. And secondly, we should not be so quick to forget about the grievances of people in the short run and just look at this as some short-sighted egotism on their side. to some degree, you always have this political trade-off between looking at particular interest and short-term interest and also at long-term interest. I would say, of course, wise statesmanship should also be careful to think of the long term rather than only for the next 4 years to the elections. However, if a couple of thousand of people lose their jobs, then this is a real problem that should be taken seriously, and that cannot be simply justified by saying, well, in 20 years others will have better jobs, so don't complain, because people actually have a reason to complain if they lose their jobs because of some political decisions. So this grievance has to be taken seriously and it has to be addressed, and it cannot just be over-trumped by saying, well, in the long run it will be better for everyone, so at least you have to offer these people something. This relates to the second question, same person. My second question is about the statement you made that a 50-year-old textile worker will not become an IT consultant. However, we can see that examples like this become more and more common. Could you explain a bit more how about this and say why this wouldn't be good? I'm not saying it wouldn't be good. I'm just not convinced that this really works for everyone in every stage of their career. So I'm not arguing against retraining programs of workers from industries that no longer exist, because those have to happen independently from free trade anyway, because there's also automation and digitalization, and certain jobs that seem to be guaranteed 10 years ago might not exist in 10 years, and you have to do something for these people. And one thing you can do as a government is offer retraining programs, so I'm not against this at all. One should only not believe that this is some kind of magic wand that will help everyone, because really, if you look at 50-year-old people that have worked the last 30 or 40 years in one kind of industry and one kind of job, it is not always possible for them to engage in these kinds of retraining programs that will give them the opportunity to have an equally good job for the last 5 or 10 years of their career in a totally new branch or new sector of the economy. This will more often not work than it will work, and they will be degraded to lower paid work, and you have to ask yourself whether this would be fair or not. This is all I was saying. I'm not against retraining. Next, there are many countries that are not part of the WTO. Can we say that international crises have less impact on their economy and trade? Actually, there aren't that many countries anymore that are not part of the WTO. There's only maybe roughly 20, and not so big countries mostly. However, there are a couple of more countries that only have observer status. And one of the countries we can discuss about here is Iran, because Iran is not a member of the WTO. They wish to be one for quite some time, and it's used as an incentive in the struggle about the nuclear program, where it was argued that if you behave nice when it comes to the nuclear program, then we might invite you to becoming a member of the WTO, because right now they only have observer status. And if we look at Iran in this crisis, we cannot say that they are affected less by it. They are affected in a specific way because they were among the first countries to be severely affected by the pandemic. They are right now witnessing the second wave that many other countries fear to happen in the future. However, they also suffer as an oil exporter. So one of the main sources of revenue for the government and for the economy is oil export. And this has been massively affected by the crisis, so they suffer big problems. In general, you can say if there is a big international trade crisis, the more involved you are with the international economy, the more affected you will be by the crisis. That is the case, but not being a WTO member does not necessarily guard you against negative effects. And we also have to think of of other countries, maybe if we think of Cuba, which is not a WTO member, for Cuba as an economy, it's quite important to have these payments of Cuban American workers who will send some money to relatives in Cuba. And if the American economy is in problems and a lot of jobs are lost, then there will be less money sent from the United States to Cuba, and this money plays an important role in the Cuban economy as it does in the economies of other developing countries. So they are not shielded from these problems because they are not WTO members. Final question: as you mentioned, free trade has many positive aspects. What kind of different meanings do worldwide initiatives, WTO and regional free trade agreements have? Will the world be covered with more regional FTAs or with wide-ranging free trade systems? The question whether the two are mutually exclusive or whether more FTAs will make international free trade more difficult has been discussed for quite some time. However, there is rather little evidence that FTAs block international free trade, because if we look at the countries that are engaged in FTAs strongly, they are typically also involved in global free trade more. So 10 years ago, most people would have argued that both the FTAs and the WTO will expand. Right now, we might see a slowdown of the expansion in both areas. So if we look at the European Union as the most integrated FTA, we see the Brexit. If we look at NAFTA, we saw that it came under attack, particularly from the American government, and has been renegotiated to the USMCA. And if we look at the WTO and some of the free trade going on there, it's also challenged. So I would say that two of them are not mutually exclusive, but both of them are under pressure at the moment. Whether you like this or not is your decision to make. Okay, that's it for today. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Goodbye.